So that was one of the many recorded uses of the R9X Hellfire, better known to the world as the Flying Ginsu missile. A modern marvel of design and the desire to kill that brings fear and confusion to the enemies of the CIA, but its origins are wrapped up in the usual level of secrecy that comes along with any covert assassination tool, and bringing it into the light is basically impossible, and what started the long chain of dominoes that led us here. It's a story of happy accidents, misunderstandings and expiry dates that led us to a weapon that only kills the people that you want and leaves a lot less collateral damage in its wake. But the best stories start at the beginning, so I guess with this one we go back to the 1970s and the winter wonderland that is the frozen north, Canada. After spending some time developing one of the most popular scientific rockets that's ever been made, the Black Brant series, the Canadians immediately begin wondering how they could weaponize the technology and use it to commit a war crime. So an idea was born. As the real innovation from the Black Brant project was the fuel it used, applying it to the military wouldn't be that difficult, so a project was born. The contemporary rocket systems of the time were the Mark 40 Mighty Mouse and the Hydra 70s. Both shared their main weakness, which was a limited range that left aircraft firing them open to manpads and other forms of short-range air defence. A weakness the North Vietnamese would exploit often when fighting the Americans, and this would appear to be the problem that the Canadians could most easily solve. So they got to work, and in the space of about 3 years they would develop a missile called the CRV-7. With a range of roughly 4,000 metres, and a comparable warhead to the Mighty Mouse and Hydra, its increased range and greater thrust impulse would lead the rockets to having a flatter trajectory, making them both more accurate and easier to aim. In the testing done for the project, it was found that they were more accurate than the main cannons of both the F-18 and the A-10s, and better than contemporary weapon systems, so a potent weapon indeed. And the Canadians would bring them into service in 1973, but in training something strange would happen. The inert training rockets had this nasty habit of puncturing through the side and roof armour of the test targets. Now the static hulls were British Centurion tanks. They were outdated, yes, but this was still a surprise to many in the Canadian Air Force. And what later testing would prove is that the steel core of the training rocket was being accelerated so fast it was acting in a similar way to an APFS-DS tank round. And this was a happy accident. An idea was born. They would replace the steel rod with a tungsten one, and end up with a rocket that could punch through the armour of a T-72 from any angle, creating one of the most effective, unguided, air-launched anti-tank weapons in NATO's arsenal. But maybe one tungsten rod wasn't enough. So following the old adage of accuracy through volume, they would simply add 4 more rods. But to some, this still wasn't enough. Combined with the fact that tanks were relatively rare on the modern battlefield, especially the ones the Canadians would fight on, they made the choice to make the rods smaller, but they put 80 in one rocket. Each could penetrate 1.5 inches of armour, so Soviet IFVs were no issue to the rocket system, and the inert flechettes would limit the creation of unexploded ordnance on the battlefield. To the Canadians it was the best of both worlds, and they would go on to export thousands of CRV-7s to the whole of the English-speaking world. Now, not a lot would happen in this story from about 1974 until 2001. They would of course be used in their intended purposes in multiple wars and prove themselves to be incredibly effective. But in 2001 a terror group decided to find out, and a war in a country that few had ever heard of and less could put on a map would kick off. Every user of the CRV-7 would join the Americans in their Afghan adventure, but one of those countries was significantly more miserly than the rest. When Britain arrived with its Apaches, armed with what were essentially flechette shotgun rockets, they would run into a problem. They couldn't use them. Of course they could attach them to their Apaches, but they only had the legal permission to use the rockets against armoured combatants, something there was a distinct lack of in the mountains of Afghanistan. And with all munitions they were on a clock to use them before they expired. It was a real conundrum. So in a satellite office of the Ministry of Defence, located at Abbey Wood in Bristol, somebody asked a very simple question. What actually is the difference between killing someone behind an inch of steel and somebody that's out in the open? And they came to the conclusion that both would die anyway. I think you see where this is going. With the lawyers happy and the politicians not told, UK Apaches began tenderising the Taliban with CRV-7s, and it was not a pretty sight, but it was incredibly effective. Add to this the lack of an explosive warhead removed the chance of leaving unexploded ordnance on the battlefield, reducing risk of collateral civilian deaths. The high accuracy and ease of aiming them made them a near-perfect assassination tool. Other users began to follow this trend, and the CIA began to take notice. Now, they didn't have access to aircraft that could fire the CBR-7. They were left out of this specific party, and I imagine that problem made them quite sad. But with a number of drone uses creeping up under Bush and exploding under Obama, they decide to marry two concepts together and have it completely under their control. A guided kinetic impactor designed for ground attack that could take out enemies and leave everyone else untouched. It's a strange timeline of events that no one could reasonably see. We went from a rocket system designed for science to a guided tool of assassination, but that is the most probable explanation for the genesis of this project. And when we look at the battlefield in Ukraine and Gaza, it shows that the West, at least, is attempting to limit the collateral damage.